All right, we left off with the Great Schism of 1054, and we're going to start in with the High Middle Ages. After 1000 AD, there were colossal changes in every facet of European existence that allowed it to grow more in exponential leaps and bounds, politically, economically, and socially. There came to be more security of life and limb without the constant threat of barbarian invasion. A farmer could plant with more confidence that he would reap. A man could build a house and expect to live his life in it and pass it to his children. And around 1000 AD, a heavier plow had been invented, coupled with new methods of harnessing horses with a collar that rested on the animal's shoulders. Thus, the amount of available animal power was multiplied. Windmills were also invented in the Low Countries, which offered a new source of power. This is a perfect example of a characteristic of modern European civilization, a faculty for invention, a quest for new sources of energy. Better ways of using the land was introduced in the three-field system. In a given year, one part was sown with one crop, a second part with another, and the third was left to lie fallow. The three parts were rotated from year to year, thus soil exhaustion was avoided at the time when fertilizers were unknown. This resulted in a boom of food production and inevitably to a population increase. With more food and more productivity, groups of people became less isolated from one another. Communications and infrastructure improved. Trees were felled and land was cleared to provide more farmland. The rural population clustered in village communities. This provided more security, more contact between families, and readier access to the blacksmith or priest. This security necessary for agriculture in villages took hold in a new system of organization known as feudalism. Feudalism was, in essence, a means of carrying on some kind of government on a local basis where no organized and central state existed. After the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, authority fell in the hands of persons who were most often called counts. These counts presided over a region covering a few hundred square miles. To build up his own position and strengthen himself for war against other counts, he tried to keep the peace and maintain control over the lesser lords in his county. These lesser lords accepted or were forced into this position, and they became his vassals, and he became their lord. The lord and vassal relationship was one of reciprocal duty. The feudal scheme, which originated locally, gradually spread and grew. Counts, in turn, became the vassals of dukes. In 987, the dukes of France selected the Duke of Ile-de-France in Paris, Hugh Capet, as their king. Similarly, the magnates of Germany elected a king in 911, and with Otto the Great, it centralized power. In 962, the first Holy Roman Emperor. Nonetheless, the French king and the Holy Roman Emperor never had that great of centralized power. In England, its lords were not given a choice. In 1066, England was conquered by the Duke of Normandy, or William the Conqueror. The Normans imposed on England a centralized and efficient type of feudalism which they had developed in Normandy. In England, from a very early date, the king and his officials had considerable power. Below the feudal world lay the vast mass of the peasantry. Here, in the village, the lowest vassal of a higher noble was lord over his subjects. The village and its surrounding farmlands constituted a manor, the estate of a lord. The peasants were known as serfs and were bound to the soil which they could not leave without the lord's permission. Few wanted to leave anyway at a time when the world beyond the village was unknown and dangerous. The Lord, in turn, owed them protection and the administration of justice. Many consequences followed from the rise of agricultural productivity. Lords and even a few peasants could produce a surplus, and since population grew with the increase of food, and since not all the new people were needed in agriculture, peasants grew restless and now wanted to move away from the manor. After the fall of Rome, the ancient cities decayed. With few exceptions, there were none left in Western Europe. Here and there, one would find a cluster of population around the headquarters of a bishop, but there were no commercial centers, thus no merchant class in the Dark Ages. This changes in the High Middle Ages. Long-distance trading was the first to develop. The city of Venice was founded around 570 AD when refugees from the barbarians settled on its islands. The Venetians, as time went on, brought eastern goods up the Adriatic and sold them to traders coming down from Central Europe. In Flanders in the north, in what is now Belgium, there developed manufacturers of the finest woolen cloth in Europe. Thus, long distance trade developed through Italian city states of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. Gradually, money came back to circulation. Craftsmen moved from the overpopulated manors to these same growing centers where they might produce wares that the lords or merchants wished to buy. This, of course, snowballed. By 1100, such centers existed all over Europe. Usually, there was one about every 20 or 30 miles. Small towns had only a few hundred inhabitants, the larger ones around 3,000. What made these towns so important was their acquisition of political rights. Where the towns were largest and closest together along the highly urbanized areas of the trade routes in North Italy are on the upper Danube and Rhine rivers, in Flanders, or on the Baltic coast, they emancipated themselves the most fully. Especially in Italy, cities like Venice, Genoa, Pisa, Florence, and Milan became independent city-states. Bruges and Ghent in Flanders carried the same power. In the Holy Roman Empire, cities like Nuremberg, Frankfurt, and Augsburg had virtual freedoms from the emperor. In England, towns weren't completely independent, however. However, they received charters of civil liberties from the king himself. Often towns formed leagues of defense, the most famous of which was the Hanseatic League. As early as the 13th century, a number of North German coastal towns had formed a commercial and military association known as the Hansa, or Hanseatic League. By 1500, more than 80 cities belonged to the League, which had extended its influence to many cities in England and Northern Europe, including the chief towns of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. For almost 200 years, the Hansa had a monopoly on the Northern European trade in timber, fish, grain, metals, honey, and wines. Within each town, merchants and craftsmen formed associations or guilds for collective supervision of their affairs. The guilds served a public purpose, for they provided that work should be done by reliable and experienced persons, and so protected people from bad craftsmanship. They also provided a means of vocational education and marked out a career for young men. Meanwhile, the kings were busy, each trying to build his kingdom into an organized monarchy that would outlast his life. Monarchy in the High Middle Ages becomes hereditary. The kings further built their central power by sending out executive officers to supervise their interests throughout their kingdoms. The kings of England had a shire reeve, or a sheriff, in each of the 40 shires. The kings of France created similar officers who were called bailiffs. The kings needed money to pay for their government and to carry on war with other kings. In certain places, lords' mandatory service to a king could be converted into a money payment called a scutage. As towns grew, merchants paid dearly for their royal charters. However, the demands for money were constantly growing and sometimes were a source of abuse. They met with frequent resistance in all counties. A famous case historically was that of the Magna Carta in England in 1215, when a group of English lords and high clergy, joined by representatives of the city of London, required King John to confirm and guarantee their historic liberties. Eventually, kings were forced to call royal councils to deal with the issues of larger central government. From this, departments of the government were hatched: the royal judiciary, exchequer, military command. From this also was hatched the institutions of parliaments. The kings had always had great parleys or talks with great lords. With the growth of towns, a new higher burgher or bourgeoisie class was added. Even though it was far inferior to the rest, it too was wealthy, too stubborn and too independent to be overlooked. The new assemblies began to rise throughout Western Europe: Cortes in Spain, Diets in Germany, Estates General in France, and parliaments in the British Isles. In summary, the 3 centuries of the High Middle Ages laid foundations both for order and for freedom. Slavery was a thing of the past, and serfdom expiring. People were in the best health and position since Roman times. It was a period of astonishing innovation, evident in significant economic, political, social, religious, intellectual, and cultural changes. Yet by the end of the 13th centuries, certain tensions had begun to creep into European society. Then the dam broke, and the tensions became a torrent of troubles.